Now, shifting from all that's wrong to what's right, the recently released film Power Struggle details the successful grassroots fight against a nuclear power plant in Vermont. Filmed over 5 years, the film shows the power of corporate deception, of captured regulatory bodies, and how people power can and will win, if we choose to stay vigilant and not give up. The Vermont Yankee power plant had been operational since the 1970s and was up for a 40-year renewal. This despite several safety missteps and dangerously aging equipment. The explosion and disaster at the Fukushima Daiichi plant in Japan in 2011 only spotlit the need to shut down Vermont Yankee, which was built in the same era and design as Fukushima. Still, the battle was hard fought and certainly hard won. And even now, there are still questions as to how this victory will play out. Here to talk more about this power struggle is Robbie Leppzer, the film's director and a veteran documentary filmmaker who has chronicled many such social justice grassroots movements. Take a look.
In the United States, there's 23 General Electric Mark I reactors identical to Fukushima Daiichi. Vermont Yankee came online almost identical time to Fukushima Daiichi Unit 1. They have the same design. They're the same reactor, same contractors worked on them, and the same flaws and weaknesses.
The containment structure designed to hold in all the radioactivity after an accident is too small. By 1986, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission had determined there was an 85% probability that the containment would blow up and fail in the event of a meltdown. So much hydrogen gas would be released that the containment would be blown to smithereens and all of the radioactivity inside it would be released to the public.
Fukushima showed us 100%, 3 of them blew up. The regulators have known that this design is incapable of withstanding an accident since it was built. During the middle of the crisis of Fukushima Daiichi, one of the key regulators at the NRC, a guy named Chuck Casto, said, "This is the worst containment in the world." Well, if it's the worst containment in the world, why are we keeping 23 of them running here in America?
What drew you to this story in particular?
Well, I live 18 miles from the Vermont Yankee nuclear power plant. And if there was ever an accident there, or a major release of radioactivity, my community would be affected. So I've been very concerned about what was happening at the Vermont Yankee nuclear power plant for a long time. Vermont Yankee nuclear power plant is located on the Connecticut River in Vermont, but just across the border from New Hampshire, and just a mile or two from the Massachusetts border. So it's right in the southeast corner of Vermont. And when I heard as a filmmaker that the Vermont legislature was the only legislature in the country with authority to make a decision about the future operation of a nuclear power plant, I felt this was an amazing opportunity to make a film to show the process of citizens being involved in a very critical issue that affects all of our lives, in this case, the safety of our communities and the future of energy. So I had no idea that I would be filming over a 5-year period. I had no idea what the outcome would be. I had no idea how the legislature would respond, how the power company would respond, how the federal government would respond.
And I think that there's something interesting about that 5-year period too, because of course, in the midst of that, and you note that in the film as well, Fukushima happened. And there was, and unfortunately there still is among some people, a view of nuclear power as clean energy, you know, not even a bridge fuel the way that we talk about fracking, but just something that can be lumped in with renewables, right? And did you notice, not obviously amongst the activists, but among just the general public, did you notice that fundamentally shift after Fukushima, even perhaps among people that had been pro Vermont Yankee before, or was it pretty much the same?
The nuclear disaster at Fukushima was definitely a wake-up call for so many people, because it really took this abstraction of this potential threat of massive nuclear radiation release in the future, and it made it very real, because 160,000 Japanese people had to be forcibly evacuated from their homes. And the area around Fukushima is now contaminated, really, most likely indefinitely into the future. It's really almost impossible to really clean it up. And so, what happened at Fukushima really made it real for people in Vermont, and I think other people around the country. It's quite interesting because, when I first got involved as a filmmaker, chronicling grassroots social change activists, I was 18, and I was a student at Hampshire College, and I got involved in making a documentary about really the birth of the anti-nuclear power direct action movement, which was at Seabrook, New Hampshire, when 1,414 people got arrested in a mass civil disobedience sit-in at the construction site of the Seabrook, New Hampshire nuclear power plant. And that action really lit a fire all across the country, catalyst, inspiration for direct action civil disobedience sit-ins at nuclear power plants all across the country. And so it's ironic that at that point, there was a high degree of consciousness among the general public about the dangers of nuclear power. It was just 2 years later that, and now we're marking the 40th anniversary of the 3 Mile Island nuclear disaster, where a meltdown occurred, and again, a massive release of radiation went into the environment and affected the public. So that really increased people's awareness, and so this awareness, unfortunately, has faded over the decades, and the nuclear industry has succeeded in their propaganda campaign to try to convince the general public that nuclear power is green and clean, and it is anything but.
Yeah, and I wanted to talk to you about that too, because one of the things that your film does that I think is great as well is highlight the role and the fate of whistleblowers in general, and in this case, Arnie Gunderson, who blew the whistle on dangerous storage of toxic radioactive materials. Talk a little bit about that importance of not only whistleblowers, but whistleblowers who then go on to combat the industry that they are experts on and were once a part of.
Well, when I first met Arnie Gunderson and his wife Maggie Gunderson at a hearing testifying at the Vermont legislature, I knew at that moment that they were going to be key characters in my film, because for me, the idea of having somebody who's actually from the inside of an industry and who really knows how it works and knows very much the dangers firsthand, and then had an experience that changed their life, and now they're speaking out. They have so much credibility because they were Arnie and Maggie were in the industry for 20 years, up until the point when they got blacklisted for doing their job, or Arnie doing his job and reporting a safety violation at the nuclear energy services company that he worked at in Connecticut. And then that was in 1990. And then, fast forward ahead to 2000, late 2000s, he's living in Burlington, Vermont, and the state legislature of Vermont asks him to be the chairperson of their watchdog committee on Vermont Yankee. And in that process, he uncovers more lies from the company that they initially denied that there was underground pipes carrying radioactive materials. And then when those very pipes leaked, they had to admit that not only do they have this massive release of radioactivity going into the groundwater, but oh, by the way, they're from pipes, underground pipes that we formerly denied ever existed. So at that point, Arnie Gundersen has a lot of credibility. And I think it was that fact-based arguments that, along with a massive public turning in Vermont, lobbying their state legislators, that caused the Vermont Senate to vote 26-4 to not renew the state license for Vermont Yankee. And you have to understand, Vermont is in a unique position where it's the only state in the country that requires a state license in addition to a federal license for a nuclear power plant. So this, when the activists realized that, they realized they had a point of leverage to be able to speak through their elected officials and have some say in the matter.
Yeah, and I want to get to that in a minute, but I also want to get to the point about the underground pipes, because as you noted, Arnie was the one who found that actually you do have underground pipes, and what he says in the film is that all nuclear power plants have these underground pipes. So then my question is, because another thing that you point out in the film is that there are dozens of similar plants in the U.S. And if all of them have these underground pipes and a lot of them are aging and need to be repaired, then what are we looking at in terms of already existing radioactive leaking? And what is that situation? Do you have a sense of what that reality is like if, based on what Arnie said, there are all of them have underground pipes?
The Associated Press reported a few years ago, and this is actually quoted in the film, that 3/4 of U.S. nuclear power plants are leaking radioactive tritium into the groundwater. And tritium is highly cancerous, and it's a routine emission from nuclear power plants. But in this case, it's actually leaking into the groundwater at most of them. Another problem with nuclear power that nuclear engineer Arnie Gundersen raises in Power Struggle is the issue of the Mark I reactors. This is the same make and model reactor that blew up at Fukushima. And it turns out that there are 21 operating nuclear power plants in the United States, virtually a quarter of the fleet, that are this first generation Mark I's. And basically the nuclear industry and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission discovered, at least by the mid-'80s, that there was a fatal flaw in the design, that basically the containment structure, which is designed to contain the radiation in the event of a major accident like a meltdown, is too small. That in the event of a major accident like a meltdown, the pressures inside the plant will build so it'll blow up, and they're almost guaranteed to blow up. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission said itself an 85% chance. This is in the mid-'80s, and Fukushima proved it. All three of the operating nuclear power plants, when Fukushima disaster happened, blew up.
And with regards to that, in the documentary, you mentioned the leaking of tritium. You also mentioned the leaking of strontium. Were there any, and obviously since the documentary takes place over a course of years, were there any noticeable issues with people? That, of course, not to say that doesn't mean that there weren't, but were there any noticeable effects on the communities because of those leaks?
In my filming at Vermont Yankee, I did not come across people who, and this is really hard to know because nobody keeps track of it. Nobody keeps track of the health effects from nuclear power plants. However, in Massachusetts, where I live, I also did filming around the Pilgrim nuclear power plant, which is on Cape Cod, and there were studies done by the Massachusetts Health Department in the 1990s that showed there was an increase of leukemias around the Pilgrim nuclear power plant within a few mile radius. There was also a citizen grassroots survey done that showed there was an increase of thyroid cancers, and thyroid cancer is definitely a marker of radiation. And I actually interviewed for that documentary 2 people who had eaten the mussels, the freshwater, the sea mussels in the bays near the Pilgrim nuclear power plant, and both of these people had contracted thyroid cancer. And fortunately, thyroid cancer, if you catch it early, it can be treated.
And that's a good point, that there aren't, the people aren't, the government is not doing its job in terms of tracking the public health effects of operating or even non-operational nuclear power plants, because as you noted at the end of the film, spoiler alert, anybody who's watching, even though the plant is closing or closed, there is still the issue of what to do with all that waste. And that's one of the things that I wanted to ask you about, was what's going on with all that waste and what happens now. I mean, it's not like it's not like an oil rig where you can just be like, okay, we've taken our stuff, the oil's still in the ground, we're cool, we're leaving. There's all this nuclear waste, and what's going on with that?
Well, it's interesting because Power Struggle has kind of a double ending. On the one hand, it's a victory, a grassroots victory of democracy in action. The citizens really played, I think, a major role in pushing Vermont Yankee over the edge. I mean, they said they closed because of financial reasons, but it was really because of the public scrutiny that pushed them over the edge. The other side of that ending is the fact that even though the nuclear plant is shut down, it's not making any more nuclear waste. The fact remains that Vermont Yankee and every single nuclear power facility, not only around the United States, but around the world, is in effect a high-level nuclear waste dump, because there is no place to put this high-level nuclear waste, which is the most toxic substances known to the planet. The plutonium that is one of the radioactive elements that is being left behind is dangerous for 250,000 years. 250,000 years. It's actually unimaginable.
Yeah, and so do you know what specifically is being done about Vermont Yankee in particular?
Well, there is a plan to dismantle the plant, but the main plan is to leave the high-level nuclear waste in what are called dry casts on site indefinitely, because there is no place to put them. There is a plan for a high-level nuclear waste dump at Yucca Mountain in Nevada on Western Shoshone indigenous land. And there's also another plan to create what's called an interim high-level nuclear waste storage site, 2 plans in New Mexico and West Texas, near indigenous and Latino communities. And this is just, in effect, what activists are calling a parking lot dump, because it's just moving the dry cast to another place, still left totally in the open and vulnerable to terrorist attack. They're not even being put in protected underground berms because the nuclear industry doesn't want to spend the money. And they're also in this situation where they're using dry cast containers with super thin metal steel walls, as opposed to in Europe, there are much thicker walls. And so there's a whole big controversy around how long will these dry casts last before they start leaking. So literally, it's kicking the can down the road, maybe a few decades, and then we're going to be in a whole situation where the high-level waste could be leaking through these casts, and now they're out in the open, and there's no way to deal with them.
Yeah, and you pinpoint another powerful issue, which is, of course, that this is predominantly indigenous and Black and brown communities that have to deal with this. It's just getting, sent to their communities. And that's on top of the open pit uranium mines that are still leaking, and that the government wants to open more uranium mining to fuel more nuclear power plants, which is, of course, also on recognized indigenous land. So it's a compounding problem that doesn't seem to have an easy answer. And with that, I wanted to discuss, you've mentioned it a few times now, what makes Vermont special, and of course that's the Public Service Board, and then them having added on to that the state legislature having to offer up a license on top of the federal license. Talk a little bit about what the process looks like for other states. Because it seems ironic that this idea that's very American, that states' rights, states' rights over federal rights, and yet states don't have to give any sort of permit. They just have to accept the federal permit to having a nuclear power plant in their state.
Well, in fact, it is quite rigged, the whole situation, that the federal government has exclusive jurisdiction over nuclear safety matters. However, all states do have authority over regulating non-safety matters. And in particular, with a lot of nuclear power plants shutting down already, and we're seeing that that's going to be rolling out in the near future, states are starting to wake up to the fact that they are going to be living with these high-level nuclear waste dumps indefinitely. So the state of Massachusetts now is actually trying to intervene in the process with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to have intervenor status for what happens when the Pilgrim nuclear power plant, which is scheduled to close at the end of May, what happens? Because it's the same issues that they're going to be dealing with at Pilgrim that are affecting people in Vermont, that are affecting people at other nuclear power plants that are closing down in Michigan. And I know in San Onofre, California, or near San Diego, the San Onofre nuclear power plant, there's a big fight going on there about how to protect this nuclear waste that's literally 100 feet from the ocean. I mean, it's ridiculous. And they're not talking about moving it further than that. I mean, it's just outrageous. And so this is what should be on people's radar screens, is that this threat of the nuclear waste is really what we're giving to future generations. And it's really unconscionable, the dangers it presents.
And of course, with that, and you mentioned that the process is very rigged, and the documentary shows how the NRC just sort of waves away people's concerns when they are finally confronted with community members. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how. Because one of the things that the documentary mentions is that the NRC knew that there was underground piping, and they knew that Vermont Yankee was lying about it, and they were like, "I'm sorry, that's just how it works." How can they? I feel kind of naive asking, like, how can they be that way? But how can they actually do that without any sort of legal ramifications? Like, could Vermont, sue the NRC and say, you knew about this, you should have done something about it? Like, how does that work?
Well, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which is the federal agency in charge of monitoring the safety of nuclear power plants, supposedly for the benefit and protection of the U.S. public, is really what's called a captured agency. The nuclear industry, it's been a revolving door, and Governor Peter Shumlin talks about this in Power Struggle, that it's a revolving door between the industry and the regulatory agencies. And so they're really and they're really watered down, the regulations. And Arnie Gunderson talks about his experiences of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission really not being interested in the issues that he raised as a whistleblower, and in fact engaging in a cover-up back in 1990. And he has documents to prove that. We wanted to get into that into the film, but there just wasn't enough time. So it's really a problem of that we're seeing now all over. I mean, under the Trump administration, agencies working for the industry that they're supposedly regulating is now commonplace. But in fact, with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, this has actually been going on for decades.
And the other thing that I thought was shocking, not necessarily surprising, was while the litigation was going on between Entergy, the company that owned Vermont Yankee, and Vermont, Vermont Yankee was allowed to operate without a state license, which seems absurd. How could you possibly operate without a state license? Is that something that could happen? Let's say that some of these other aging plants enter into litigation about whether they can continue operating, and so then the NRC is like, oh, well, just go ahead and keep operating without a license. Do you see that as being something that could happen in other places?
It's already happened. I mean, the Pilgrim nuclear power plant, when it was up for its 40-year license renewal, the NRC didn't actually vote and approve it until well after the license had expired. So that's just, showing how the system is just totally rigged in terms of the nuclear industry, favor. And also at Pilgrim, they've literally gotten kind of slaps on the wrist for major safety violations that even their own NRC inspectors, in an internal memo where they're talking among themselves and commenting about how the safety culture was very poor at the Pilgrim nuclear power plant. This memo got inadvertently released, and it was what very revealing to show how they talk about these situations behind closed doors, but to the public, they just put out this face that everything is okay and there's nothing to worry about.
Yeah. And so kind of wrapping up, I wanted to, because it's such a powerful story, and also speaks to the power of sticking with it, because of course Vermont Yankee had been opposed since it opened in 1972, and so this was definitely playing the long game. But I also noticed, Vermont has a lot of things going for it. Not only was it that state that you mentioned that requires a specific state license rather than just a federal one, but it's also interesting that their legislators seem to care. When folks showed up after having marched, they were greeted by legislators who seemed to care what they had to say. They responded to that public pressure. And on top of that, it seemed that a lot of the people in the community had the time and the ability, financial or otherwise, to be a part of this resistance. A lot of them seemed to be older, perhaps retired, so that they, in a lot of communities, again, like you mentioned, Indigenous, Black, and Brown are mostly the most marginalized, so they might be working 3 jobs. They don't have time to go to these meetings or engage in this direct way, and they certainly aren't represented by their government. So I was wondering if you could speculate perhaps on if that state didn't have that interested or progressive leaning legislator and didn't have activists who had the time and financial or other ability to really give to this, do you think they would have fared as well?
Well, I would say that really it was the public participation, the grassroots activists, that made a huge difference here. Vermont Yankee would still be operating, I believe, if it wasn't for the scrutiny of the public that put pressure on their state legislature to act, to come out with a very strong vote to not renew the license, and to put all of their legislators and state officials on notice that the people were watching. And I think that made it just all the more difficult for Entergy, the power company that ran Vermont Yankee, which is the second largest nuclear power company in the United States, to not cut corners. They couldn't get away with cutting corners. So I think when it came down to the economic equation, they threw in the towel. But it was because of the scrutiny. And frankly, what we've been told by some of the people who are nuclear safety watchdogs and advocates, not only Arnie Gunderson, but people like Dave Lochbaum from the Union of Concerned Scientists, who report that really the only places around the country where the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, is giving any kind of extra scrutiny is where there's a profound grassroots citizen activism demanding more safety. So you see that at the Indian Point nuclear power plant in New York City. You see that at the Diablo Canyon and San Onofre nuclear power plants in California. You see that in some of the plants in Illinois. There's a strong group in Chicago. And you're starting to see it now with the citizen groups that are rising up in Texas and New Mexico, as well as the longstanding Shoshone resistance in Nevada to oppose those waste dumps in those states.
And so finally, I mean, one of the things that happens at the very beginning of the film is there's a map of all the nuclear power plants, and you say that 1 in 3 Americans lives within 50 miles of a nuclear power plant. So that means that a lot of people that aren't currently activated on this subject probably live close to a nuclear power plant and don't realize it. What would you suggest would be a good tool or tools for them to get activated in terms of this? Is there like a national resistance to nuclear power plants, or what would be your suggestion?
Well, I would suggest several things. I mean, first of all, to find out more information about Power Struggle, the movie, go to powerstrugglemovie.com. And not only is there information about Power Struggle, the documentary, but we're going to be posting additional videos about nuclear power on the site. And as part of the film airing on Free Speech TV, I'm also going to be moderating a series of Facebook Live forums hosted by Free Speech TV in May that will explore in 4 half-hour programs interviews with activists who are fighting nuclear waste dumps in the West, impacts on indigenous communities, an extended interview with Arnie and Maggie Gunderson talking about nuclear safety, and a look at nuclear economics and alternative energy prospects. So if you go to the website, again, powerstrugglemovie.com, there'll be links to those programs, and they'll be live, but we'll also post them so they'll be available ongoing. In addition, I would say there's 2 national groups that have really excellent websites to check out: beyondnuclear.org and NIRS, which stands for the Nuclear Information Resource Service. Both, and that's NIRS.org. Both of those websites have really good material about what's going on with nuclear power. And then there's another weekly podcast called nuclearhotseat.com. And that's a weekly hour-long podcast produced by Libby Halevi, based in Los Angeles, and really has everything you want to know about nuclear power on a weekly basis. So there's a lot of information out there. And with these activist groups, you can connect with the local activism that's happening in your area.
I just want to hold on something for a moment. 250,000 years. 250,000 years, that's how long nuclear waste remains radioactive. 250,000 years. 1 in 3 Americans live within 50 miles of an operating nuclear reactor. And we have 23 plants that are identical to Fukushima in the US. Just sit with that. And then head over to beyondnuclear.org to get involved in the fight against nuclear energy here in the US. For the complete interview with Robbie, please check out our social media and our podcast, which airs every Friday on Spotify, Stitcher, iTunes, and Libsyn. To get info on how you can watch the film, go to powerstrugglemovie.com.